During Units 6 and 7 of CMST 387, we had been covering responsive design and the various frameworks that you can leverage to build a responsive website. If you haven't already done so, please go back and review chapters 4 and 5 of Ben Freen's Responsive Web Design book, which was assigned during Unit 7 of our class. These chapters build on the earlier chapters of the book that you would have read in Unit 6. However, the focus is specifically on responsive frameworks. For your final project of the semester, you're expected to create a fully responsive website leveraging responsive design principles and frameworks, including Flexbox and CSS Grid. This is what these chapters cover, and this is what I'm going to use to build a basic layout in this video. Before we do that, let's take a quick minute to summarize the benefits of both of these frameworks. Flexbox is great for arranging items in a single row or column, making it useful for things like navigation menus or centering elements on a page. It automatically adjusts content to fit different screen sizes, making layouts more flexible and reducing the need for complicated coding tricks. CSS Grid, on the other hand, is designed for more complex layouts involving both rows and columns, like full web pages with headers, sidebars, and content areas. It provides more precise control over positioning while keeping the code cleaner. While Flexbox works best for simple, one-directional layouts, Grid is ideal for structuring entire pages. Designers often use both together to create flexible and responsive websites that work well on any device. What I'm going to do here is walk through a super simple website design using both Flexbox and CSS Grid. I like to start any project with a rough sketch, so I'm going to use one of my favorite tools for doing this, draw.io. Okay, so here I am in the draw.io site. I'm going to create a basic layout. I'm just going to call it CMST 387, and I'm going to pick an existing template that's already available. So let's take a look here. They have maps, network, other software, wireframes. Sounds like something I might want to use. I want something basic just to create a standard website layout with a few columns and nav bar. This looks like something I might want to use. If I hit create, save. Okay, so it's giving me a basic website layout. It has more elements than I'm really looking for here. I'm going to go ahead and remove the logo. I'm going to move these topics over to the left. These will be my links for my website layout. I don't think I'm going to bother with a search, at least not for this layout. So let's just make this a little bit smaller. So my main nav bar is going to be along the top. This layout comes with a section bar horizontally along the top as well as vertically. I don't think I really need the horizontal section bar, but what I can do is leverage this for my header. So I'm going to do that. Get rid of these other links and then move my header up. So this would be my header of whatever topic I've selected here. So if I've selected topic 1, this would be a topic 1 header, and then the different sections of topic 1 would fall down here. The idea is I'm trying to make this mimic closer to what we're looking for the CMST 387 final project, where it's going to be a resources website. So there should be a resources section, and in that resources section, we're going to be covering different topics like web application security, web performance optimization, etc. And those will be items that I would lay out down the side in this specific wireframe. All right, so let's tidy this up a little bit. I'm going to move these sections up. I don't need all of the links here, so I'm just going to remove some of these. And I'll move these up. This will be my main content area. I'm just going to leave it as a box for now, and we can modify that later if needed. I don't really need 3 columns. I know some websites will require that. Depending on your own needs and your own design, you may use 3 columns. For this basic layout, I'm just going to use 2. So I'm going to get rid of the 3rd column. And I am going to make this bottom bar my footer and make it smaller and expand my content area to cover the bulk of the layout and pull my footer across. So this is the basic layout. Again, this would need to be responsive. So when I reduce the size of this layout, these different sections would respond accordingly. The menu would also need to respond to the navigation bar. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to mimic this design and build this out using both CSS Grid, which will be used for capturing the main layout of this website, as well as Flexbox for managing my nav items. Ready to start coding out this layout. Let's go into Visual Studio Code. So I've cheated a little bit here by adding in some content, which I'm going to use for my main content area for this layout, just so we have something that we can look at. And this is taken from our responsive web design unit. So to get us started, I'm going to create an index file, which will be our homepage. And I'm going to use a standard HTML5 layout. I'm just going to call it responsive layout. In my responsive layout, I want to mimic what we have in our wireframe. So the way this is broken up, I want to have a main nav section, and then under the nav section will be my main container, which is going to house the header along with the sidebar and content area, as well as the main footer at the bottom of the layout. So let's start mocking this out. All right, so I'm going to need my nav bar, which I'll just step out here, and I'll give it some basic boilerplate links. Then under my nav, I'm going to need my main container. And in my container is where I will keep my header, sidebar, which I will use the aside tag for, and of course my main content. And then under my main content, I'm going to have my footer. All right, so I'm going to change some of these because these were just boilerplate links that were thrown in here. So I'm just going to change these all to match what I want to have in my layout. I'm just going to stub these out with just basic placeholder links. All right, so the page I'm going to be working on will be the web application resources, which is what we are building out in the CMST 387 final project. So because I'm going to work on that page layout, I'm going to set this as an active link, and we will style this accordingly later. All right, so going back to my boilerplate content, I'm going to copy this and put it into our main section down below. I'll just fix this up. All right, our footer is just going to have the text footer for now. And then our sidebar is going to have the different links that we will have for our resources. So this will contain our navigation and again, some boilerplate links, which I'm going to change to the various topics that we will be providing for these web application resources. All right, so let's see what this looks like so far. Granted, I haven't put any styles in yet, so I don't expect anything magical here, but at least we have our main content laid out. It looks like I forgot to put in something for our header. Let's just put in some text for web development resources. All right, so the idea is this nav bar will be our main nav bar, which would be along the top, which mimics closely to what we had in our mockup. And then our header would come underneath the main nav bar, followed by our sidebar, main content area, and footer. So what I'm going to do here is, like I said at the beginning of the video, we want to use both CSS Grid for laying out our main content, as well as Flexbox for our nav bar. So we're going to start with CSS Grid, laying out our main grid layout. So let's go ahead and create our CSS file, which will contain the styles for our grid. Okay, so before I start adding any styles, I want to take a look at my HTML structure to see if there's anywhere I'll need to call out a specific class. So right away, I'm noticing the nav bar area that I want to use Flexbox with. I'm going to want to include a class to call that out because I have two nav bars, one on the sidebar, which will contain our resources, and I do not want to use Flexbox there. I do, however, want to use Flexbox for the main navigation. So I'm going to go ahead and add a class. So I can style this accordingly. And then what I'm going to do is add a new CSS file, which is blank currently, and we'll add styles to it. And I will need to reference this in my HTML. Okay, so we're ready to start adding our styles. The first thing we want to do is add our basic global styles, which would be our body style. So let's go ahead and do that. First of all, I'm going to set a margin of 0. And then I want to just use the font family I typically stick with, which is a sans serif font family. For the background color, I do want it to look a little bit different so we can see as we're making changes here. And we'll just give it, so we can see the change there. And we'll be overlaying our grid items on top of that. We'll use white, so it will show where the grid columns are defined. And then lastly, our font color, I will just set to this. Next, we need to set up our container that we're going to leverage CSS Grid on. And if we go back to our code here, where I've defined the container, this is essentially the entire section where I will be applying CSS Grid. So inside of here, we have our header, our sidebar, which is using the aside tag, as well as our main content area and our footer. If we go back to our layout here, this would be the entire area here from header right down to the sidebar, content, and footer sections. All of this we're going to be wrapping in our CSS grid framework. So going back to styles, I'm going to find my container. In order to set this up for CSS grid, we need to set display grid. Next, I'm going to define the grid template areas. And these are essentially the sections that will be within our grid. So again, going back to our header, we know that header is going to take up 2 entire columns. Underneath header, we're going to have our left navbar, which is defined in the aside tag. And on the right, we have our main content. And then beneath that, we'll have our footer, which also is going to wrap across the 2 columns. To do this, I'm going to enter header twice. And then our main section is going to come after our sidebar, and then footer, again, like header, will wrap the 2 columns. This will make more sense in a moment when I define these areas within our CSS properties. Next, I'm going to add some additional styling to our grid. What I've done here is define that the left column is going to be set at 200 pixels, and the right column will be fluid at 1 FR. So now that I've set up my CSS grid, I'm going to further style the header, aside, main, and footer sections, and then we will provide individual styling for each of these. So you see on the right here, where we're previewing our site, these columns are starting to take shape in terms of our overall layout. We're going to add some additional styles to each of these sections. For header, we're going to set our CSS grid header here. Remember, header in our index.html is defined as a header tag. Here, what we're doing is we are setting it to the header value defined under the grid template areas. And you'll notice because we have now defined this as our header, this CSS header is now wrapping the 2 columns as defined here. Next, let's do the same for the aside tag, the main tag, and the footer. In addition, I'm going to add some additional styles to the footer. All right, let's add a couple extra styles to our header. I'm also going to add some more styles to my aside. That is the sidebar here to give it a little bit better look in terms of the links that we want to render here. This is starting to look a little bit better. I'm going to add a few more styles to the sidebar. And I'll also want to make my responsive web design active, since that's the page or resource that we're currently on. So go back to index.html. Because I've added the style already, I just need to add ID equals active. And I need to fix this so it's referencing the ID active. Okay, so at this point we have styled our entire CSS grid layout from the header, which is wrapping across 2 columns, then our aside sidebar, which is taking up the 200 pixels on the left, and then the 1 FR, which is the 1 fraction, which is taking up the remainder of the page. If I wanted this to be a 50-50 split, I could have had my sidebar 1 FR and the content 1 FR as well, as that will respond that way. Like so. However, in this case, I want to keep my sidebar to a fixed 200 pixels width. All right, so at this point, we have completed our CSS grid layout. Let's take a look at styling this top navigation area. If you recall at the beginning of the video, I did say we were going to use Flexbox for this. And in fact, if we go back to our index.html file, you will recall that we gave it this Flexbox nav class. So we're going to use this to define our Flexbox styles for our main navigation. All right, so let's go ahead and add some of our Flexbox nav styles. We're going to start with a background color similar to our header. Let's give it a padding of 1 rem. All right, and then for our actual unordered list, which is going to contain our main navigation itself, we are going to want to give it a display of flex, similar to how we set up the CSS grid display earlier on. Let's do list style type of none. We'll do 0 margin and padding. We'll provide a gap of 1 rem. All right, our top nav is starting to look a little bit closer to what we want. So let's go ahead and wrap this up. All right, and then finally, we want to give it some active and hover effects over here. All right, and so if you recall earlier, we'd already set the web application resources to active because this is the page we were wanting to style. And then I've added this hover effect to the other links. So at this point, we pretty much have our entire layout styled with CSS Grid here, and then we're using Flexbox to help us style the main navigation menu at the top. So you'll notice as I shrink this, our grid, our CSS grid responds well. However, ideally we would want these grid items to wrap above each other or below each other. Along with our menu itself, we would want this to wrap slightly different in a mobile context. So we're going to do that next by leveraging media queries in our code. Okay, so the way I want this to work is when I've resized my web page to under 768 pixels, which is what I'll set in the CSS, I want these grid columns to align under each other so we no longer have a squished sidebar and then a content area that's squished in here. So if we go back up to our main container, we're going to want it to set this up so it's just one entire row for header, one entire row for our sidebar, and then followed by one entire row for our main, and then footer. We can do this by adding a media query so the browser senses when we're under a certain width, it will apply an overridden style instead of the main container style here. To do this, let's go ahead and add a new section for media queries for smaller screens. All right, to do this, I'm going to invoke the media property, and I'll set a max width of, say, 768 pixels. And inside of here, I'm going to redefine my container. And this time, I'm just going to set my main header, followed by my sidebar, followed by main, and lastly my footer. In order for this to work, I will set my grid template columns to 1FR. If you recall from earlier, 1FR stands for one fraction, which in this case, because I only have one column, it's going to consume the entire width of the page. And as you can now see, my header is at the top, followed by my sidebar, followed by my main content, followed by my footer. If I was to expand this above the 768 pixels, you'll see that it responds back to the previous layout we had. So this is great. However, I also want to apply some styles to my Flexbox navigation at the top. So let's go ahead and do that as well. And we'll add a few more styles to tidy this up further. All right, so now we have a nicely formatted top nav bar, which is styled with Flexbox. Then our main CSS grid container, which has been styled here. And again, if I expand this out, I will go back to my main desktop view. So hopefully this has given you a quick overview for how to put together a responsive website using both CSS Grid as well as Flexbox. Depending on your own requirements, your own needs, you will probably find yourself using these frameworks slightly differently to fit your own website design. I've posted these code files in our class. If you have any questions as you start working on the project, please feel free to reach out in class and I will try to address any questions you have. Good luck with your project, and I look forward to seeing your final website.